It's time for another installment of Vampires in Their Own Words, an anthology of vampire voices edited by Michelle Bellinger. Stranger Than Fiction. When considering the start of the real vampire movement, one cannot divorce it entirely either from folklore or fiction. Both mythic and fictional portrayals of vampires have had a significant impact on the real vampire community, helping to shape aesthetics, practices, and philosophies of its various members. The aspect of the community has direct ties to Lord Byron, who decisively imported the concept of the vampire to the English literature. The supernatural 1960 soap opera Dark Shadows, I love that one, played a significant role, as well as through the sympathetic character of Barnabas Collins. The program allowed vampires to be seen as more than just a charnel house monster. Barnabas, the first reluctant vampire, undoubtedly influenced the imagination of the writer Anne Rice, who went further the appeal of the vampire archetype through the characters of her Vampire Chronicles, starting with the publication of Interview with the Vampire in 1976. The Vampire Lestat, depicted as a modern rock star, drew the vampire archetype out of moldering graveyards and into popular consciousness, transforming this complex archetype from a fearsome monster to a sex symbol and, for some, even a role model. For those just beginning to hesitantly and somewhat guiltily identify themselves as vampire in the late 80s and early 90s, the long tradition of fiction and folklore was at once confusing and compelling. Many people drawn to the image of the vampire wrestled with all of the trappings that had come to associate with the archetype over the years. Some adopted the image eagerly, dressing up as vampires, complete with fangs and capes, while others rebelled against this stereotype, instead of combing through the folklore for the grain of truth that made them feel a connection to this powerful world vampire, despite their own ambivalence towards the traditional representations. The vast majority of the nascent vampire community has nothing to go on to save their own experiences, underscored in some by a strange, instinctual knowledge that every day they could not explain. The only way these isolated individuals even came to develop into the community was due to their need for answers that can only be gleaned from others who experience similar things. It started in fanzines and newsletters like the Midnight Sun and the Dark Rose Journal. These publications were devoted at first to the idea of vampires and later to addressing vampires more openly as a reality. The community began in organizations such as Eric S. Held's Vampire Information Exchange, groups and networks that sought to connect people of like minds and interests as pen pals for doing so. It started in private letters and impromptu meetings, often held in the unlikeliest of places. In keeping with the real vampire's complicated identity, straddling truth and fiction, early members of the vampire community often started out meeting one another at horror conventions or at role-playing games. These were places where vampires could be spoken about openly at a time when even vampires themselves wrestled with belief. When people have finished discussing the vampire in fiction and folklore, then they might be able to raise the question of vampire as a reality. If the individuals involved in the discussion exhibited the same hesitant curiosity about what vampirism really might be, then the conversation might take off entirely on a new direction. Reluctantly, fearfully, real vampires would admit their suspicions to one another. Though these hesitant, guarded communications, vampires begin to build the foundation of a real community bound together through common experiences and beliefs. In years before the internet, the process was slow. People were limited by geography, and not everyone was comfortable meeting to discuss vampires face to face. Secrecy was for safety for many of the early members of the community, especially considering what belief in vampirism might mean if outed at the workplace or even to one's family. Once vampires found their way onto the World Wide Web, however, things changed suddenly and radically. One of the most influential and controversial vampire groups in the mid-90s, the Sanguinarium, was very openly patterned on the network of vampires featured in the novels of Anne Rice. The Sanguinarium was one of the many vampire networks to come out of the shadows and onto the internet in the mid-90s. The Sanguinarium influence was not due to any widespread belief that it had all the answers on vampires or vampirism. Rather, its influence stemmed from sheer visibility and the persistence of its founder. A highly controversial figure, the founder of Sanguinarium is a man of changeable passion, known variously as the word of Sabretooth, Father Sebastian, Father Todd, and most recently, Sebastian von Houten. The mention of his names inspires strong, and it's not always positive, reactions from members of the community. Nevertheless, he remains one of the main reasons the community is visible as it is today. I think I should stop here for a moment because you know what it is? I actually know the Sanguinarium community. But that's all I have to say. Let me continue, please. Father Sebastian was a New York City-based club promoter. Yes, I've been to his parties. And fangmaker who had both the desire and resources to publish material about real vampires. Although the accuracy of some of his material can be debated, Sebastian compiled a lexicon of vampires term that is largely in use today. He dreamt up a complicated court system of vampire groups and houses that, in its very romanticism, appealed to many who were seeking a more formal sense of community. Then they were going through pen pals and impromptu meetings at coffee houses. Ultimately, he published his review, Vampire Almanac, its first release in 1998. This digest-sized book was part of the Vampire Encyclopedia and part club resource, but it remained one of the earliest and most widespread publications by a vampire for a growing community of vampires. The years 96 and 97 saw such a profusion of real vampire web pages that many researchers have been tempted to link the start of the vampire community with these early appearances on the internet. In addition to the Sanguinarium, there were also coven organizations founded by an individual who went by the name of Osiris and who was in ambivalent connections with Father Sebastian's. Damien DeVille's Vampire Church followed soon after. Sanguinarians set up a website offering support and advice for real vampires, as did Sphinx Cat, Vodolok, Hirudu, and as well as many names have faded into anonymity. There was a lot of confusion in those days between vampire role-playing sites and those pages devoted to vampirism as a serious and personal reality. This led to the rift between the two communities, with role-players speaking out loudly against people who, in the opinion of role-players, had simply taken the game too far. The vampires, in turn, began to make it abundantly and somewhat bitter clear in the first few paragraphs of their webpage, and they were not role-players, nor would vampire role-playing be tolerated on their sites. The intensity of emotion led many individuals on both sides to willfully forget or obscure how intertwined both communities once were. An example, the Black Veil, a vampire code of conduct first devised by Father Sebastian, was originally patterned for the traditions of Masquerade, a code conduct used within the role-playing game Vampire the Masquerade. That role-playing game, published in 1991 by White Wolf Publishing, was partly inspired by the creative observations of the social games playing out the Gothic Club in Atlanta. The club, known as Masquerade, was one of the many places where real vampires met and interacted during the early days of the modern community. At least one of the writers from White Wolf, Sam Chupp, has come forward to openly admit that he drew upon pagan and magical beliefs to inspire certain aspects of his work. Art imitates life, which imitates art, and it's a never-ending cycle. The Codex and the ISV. My magical and wholly unethical experiments in vampirism occurred throughout the late 80s. It was not until the fall of 1991 that I encountered a few others who identified as I did. Once I met others who shared my experience, I had to face the ethical reality of what I was doing. Vampirism was not all in my head, and my actions had a palpable impact on the people around me, an impact for which I realized I needed to take responsibility. The early 90s saw the start of my involvement in developing an ethical way of meeting my needs. I did not want to be the kind of psychic vampire one reads about in the books like Dion Fortune's Psychic Self-Defense. Knowledge is power, and so I sought as much knowledge and understanding about my condition as possible, with the hope that I could ultimately harness my innate interaction with energy towards something positive for both myself and those around me. There are several pagans, Wiccans, occultists, and even a few vampires in the new social circle that I discovered once I was in college. Although I was thrilled to finally have others to discuss my theories and experiences with, it quickly became apparent that most of these people knew as little as I myself, or even less. One older man claimed to be able to cure my vampirism through sex magic. He genuinely offered me a personal injection of potent life. I declined. Another woman, only a few years older than me, became convinced that I embraced her after she allowed me to feed upon her. I thought the claim was ridiculous. No one had made me a vampire, and I was almost certain that my vampirism was an inborn quality. It was not something that could be catched like a cold or passed on as fictional vampires did in the movies. Nevertheless, she persisted in her belief, going on to become involved in the vampire community in her own right. She founded the Vampire Donor Alliance and later told a colorful version of her embrace to FHM magazine. Somewhat displeased with the quality of people in my immediate surroundings, I continued to hope that there was others out there who actually knew what this strange ability was and how to best handle it. This led me to December of 1991 to start a magazine called Shadow Dance. On the surface, the self-published zine was devoted to art, literature, and poetry with dark and vampiric themes. Underneath that surface, I hope to find others who, like myself, describe through fiction and poetry the beliefs and experiences that they dare not speak out loud in any other form. I quickly learned that there were many others who found themselves in my position, isolated, confused, and searching. The small press magazine and voluminous correspondence that occurred behind the scenes were my first introduction to the vampire community. It took many years for anything that truly resembled a community to grow out of the hesitant letters and loose networks of people that surrounded the various small press publications. For my part, I kept searching for people who had answers about vampirism worked, what caused it, and why we were the way we were. Mostly, I met with more questions. From the general response we got, I started to think that I knew as much as anyone out there, and perhaps because I've taken the time to experiment with my abilities and observe the results, I knew a little bit more. Ethics, especially, had become very important to me, particularly considering the unethical practices I had to engage in while still coming to terms with what I was. I was unhappy with the negative portrayals of psychic vampires in the self-defense text and among pagans in general. And I became determined to elaborate on methods that made it possible not only to feed on ethically, but to take the energy exchange and turn it into something positive and transformational for all parties. All of this led me to my major contribution to the vampire community as it still exists today, the book called The Psychic Vampire Codex. In 1994, the network of vampires writing to one another behind the scenes of my literary magazine, Shadow Dance, has grown to the point where this exchange of information still needed a publication of its own. Late in that year, I started formalizing this network of pen pals into a loose organization, which became the International Society of Vampires, or ISV. The ISV was a member-based organization with a monthly newsletter, The Midnight Sun. The newsletter started publication in 1995, in addition to the newsletter, which were to have access to a work I had been preparing for since 1994. I referred to it several times, including the Codex Sanguinaricus and the Codex Vampiricus. Mostly, it got abbreviated to the Codex. This was a collection of my theories and observations on vampirism derived from both experiments and personal intuitions. One of the main points addressed by the Codex was the fact that vampirism was something that could be harnessed in a positive fashion. One did not have to be an energy predator, but with awareness and discipline could come to harness the ability to connect to other people's energy in a way that was helpful and even healing to both the vampire and the donor. This work circulated at first in small sections to save on printing costs. The cost of printing was always an issue, both with Shadow Dance and with the Midnight Sun. This cost, together with the rising postage rates and growing issues with the postal system itself, led me to stop the publication of book magazines and the newsletter in 1996. There were also larger issues involved in my decision to bring nearly 5 years of work to an end. 1996 was the year of the vampire in the media, and this was not a good thing. In Florida, a troubled young man named Rodney Farrell drove to a friend's house and bludgeoned her parents to death. He claimed to be the vampire. Susan Walsh, a woman who did freelance work for the Village Voice in New York, disappeared while doing an expose on the New York City's growing vampire culture. Rodney Farrell's action led him to become the youngest person on Florida death row. Susan Walsh was never heard of again. This might be the end of the story for me, but the vampire community wouldn't let me fade away so easily. While I was publishing newsletters for people in Britain, Germany, and as far as Turkey, many other individuals have begun forming their own groups and organizations as well. New York City was a hotbed for such activity, as there were several other large cities in the United States, including Los Angeles and New Orleans. The community in each city had its own distinct development, flavored by the attitudes of the city itself, as well as the main movers of the city. Many of the vampires in New York had romanticized the idea of a courtly culture, which led the community here to become very formal and elegant. With a focus on fashion, high society, and etiquette, Father Vincent, Father Sebastian, and the middlesmith D. Drennan were all main forces behind the early New York scene, each adding his flair for the dramatic to the overall aesthetics of what it became, known as the Court of Gotham. The vampires in New Orleans fought a battle of love and hate with the image that the city has portrayed in the novels of writers such as Anne Rice and Poppy Z. Brite. Thanks to these writers, New Orleans was seen by many as a city of vampires. The undead, in addition to the spirits and voodoo, became part of the French Quarter tourist scene. Some vampires, like Lord Chaz, decided to capitalize on this, running the genuine vampire tours in the city. Others resented such ventures, feeling that they trivialized the reality of their vampirism. Los Angeles developed in almost the direct contrast to the New York, with vampires in Los Angeles resulting any formalization into their community. They rejected the haute couture of New York City, seeing it as trite and frivolous. Damanox, a main inspiration in the community of the West Coast, remains someone who eschews all the popular imagery of vampires, especially the hierarchy court structure of so many typical New York vampires. I just want to see. All right, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to end it here because the introduction goes on for another 10 pages. So let's stop it here and then I'll do another chapter.